So I mentioned in my last video that I was banned from R Christians, a fundamentalist subreddit, and while I didn't expect much of it, I didn't really expect a ban, but it gave me a realization that I'd found new material. And I would like to introduce you to Creation.com, a creationist echo chamber and source of apologetics, and we're going to be looking at the article called Fallacy: Creationists Can't Be Scientists. The author begins his article by talking about how he taught freshman English at Asbury College and introduced a creationist book into his curriculum called Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds. Now, I find this kind of strange that an English teacher would try to teach this, because it's not a science class. An English class is somewhere where an English teacher gives you literature to talk about, discuss, write papers on, but not science things. It's not his place. And he seemed surprised when the science faculty, which I'm very proud that they did this, came to him and asked him to remove it from his curriculum, because that wasn't his area. And he goes on to say that he became convinced of creation separate of any resources from creationist websites, which, that's fine. That's okay. But he says that he knew the subject of creation well enough to survive the onslaught of evolutionary questions. And this I find strange, because who can really know creation? Because there's nothing to know about it. All you have to do is appeal to the Bible. There's nothing to know besides what you believe yourself. The author then goes on to mention that a Dr. James Benke, who apparently taught at Asbury College, said that creationists like Dr. Steve Austin aren't real scientists. And while I would disagree with Dr. Benke that they're not real scientists, I would agree with him that they aren't good scientists. Because Dr. Steve Austin is one of the leading people that believes that the Grand Canyon was caused by the flood of Noah. And this is demonstrably false. It's ludicrous that he would even try to assert this. But still he does. And he's simply doing science to confirm his presuppositions, which is not how science works. While he is a real scientist, he is a bad one. And Dr. Benke pointing out that Steve Austin does bad science seemed to the author as an ad hominem attack, which it is not. An ad hominem is when you attack a person's character, like saying, this person's views are wrong because he sleeps with other women than his wife. This is ad hominem. Dr. Benke just accused Dr. Steve Austin of doing bad science, which is not an ad hominem attack. It's criticizing the actual argument. The author then goes on to talk about a case in Spain, and I can't tell if this is hypothetical or real because no last names are mentioned, only first names, and, well, I guess it's true. But it talks about how a bunch of quote-unquote evolutionist professors went through parroting logical fallacies to promote evolution. And they did things like attacking the credentials of creationists, which that's not an ad hominem attack. Again, this is saying that they have no credibility because they have no credentials, and that's okay. Because if an English professor, like this man, got up to talk about how evolution is false, you could rightly say that he has no room to talk about it because he has no credentials. And that's not ad hominem. That's attacking his merits, which is again the opposite of attacking the man itself. It's not saying you kill cats, so we shouldn't listen to you. It is saying that you're not qualified, so we don't have to, and nothing you say is of any importance at all. Then the author goes on to spout his own logical fallacy. Look, there are thousands of scientists that believe in creationism, so who are you to say it's wrong? This is a logical fallacy called argument from authority, and even argument ad populum. It's saying that it's popular, it's widespread, so it must be true, and that these people that are more qualified than you believe it, so surely it must be true. This is a logical fallacy. And then he goes on to mention that atheists and agnostics can also be theologians, because while they can, and certainly there are, the field of theology is dominated by Christians, because these Christians want to go in and prove their beliefs, which is not wrong, it's just dominated by it. And then he goes on to mention a syllogism. And the syllogism goes, A is not equal to B, and C is equal to A. Therefore, C can never be equal to B, and this is true mathematically and syllogismically? I don't know how to say that. However, regardless of my vocabulary, he's wrong. He then fills in the variables for us. A is equal to religion, B to science, and C to creation. So if you filled them in, it would go, religion is not equal to science, creationism is religion. Therefore, creationism can't be science. And that is true, because creationism can't be science. it's totally religious. It can't be based on fact. There's no way to test it. There's no way to falsify it. There's no way to do anything with it. There's no way to make predictions with it. It's not science. So why do people try to teach it as science? Then the author goes on to say that evolution is believed without any empirical evidence, and this is simply false, because if you know anything about evolution, then you know that it is believed on empirical evidence, such as the fossil record, such as the DNA record, such as homology, phylogeny, observing the change in species. It's easily provable, and it's not believed presuppositionally. No one, not even Charles Darwin, wanted to just prove his idea of evolution. He simply looked at the evidence and came up with it afterward. He didn't say, I have an idea called evolution and let's look at some evidence in order to prove it. No, he found the evidence first and he extrapolated on this evidence in order to back up his idea. And it's true that creationists can be scientists. No one is saying anything to the contrary. They just can't be evolutionary biologists because, of course, their beliefs wouldn't allow them to do that. They couldn't make research into evolution and still believe what they did because they would probably skew the results. This is just a fault of people, not creationism. What follows are a series of logical fallacies, well, quote-unquote logical fallacies, that the author believes that evolutionists use to support their claims, and I'm going to pick apart every one. The first one, he says, is begging the question, and the example goes, the similarity between living things, genetically as well as morphologically, in form shows that they are all related to each other and evolved from a single or original life form. I don't see a problem with this. This is not begging the question. This is not using your premise as the conclusion, because we never said that all things are related, thus they're related. This is simply saying that all things appear to be similar, and if we follow that back, if we follow that we know that changes happen between them, then we can conclude safely that they all have a common ancestor. This isn't a logical fallacy at all. This is, well, it's nothing at all. It's just proof of evolution. The next argument he believes is a straw man, which is attacking a misrepresentation of the target and then claiming to have disproven the case. And this happens all the time for creationists because they have straw men of evolution, which are often catchy sayings like, from the goo to the zoo to you, or molecules to man. These are straw men of evolution. But regardless, let's look at his supposed straw man. Creationists believe in fixity, which is the immutability of species. Fixity is shown to be false, therefore evolution is true and creation is false. Fixity is false. Species do change. That's not a bad thing. Now, I wouldn't say that you can just say that creationism is false, therefore evolution is true, because creationism was never science in the first place. There was no opposing viewpoints. Creationism wasn't considered science long before Darwinian evolution ever entered the scene. Before Darwinian evolution, there was Lamarckian evolution, and Lamarck believed that creatures, based on their needs and their wants, could change their form. So, if a giraffe needed to reach taller leaves, his offspring would have longer necks. And while he got the idea, he was still wrong. But this was the only theory that challenged Darwin's theory of evolution. What we can take from this is that the only opposing theory to Darwin's theory of evolution was a previous theory of evolution. In his next example, he used Ernst Haeckel's embryos, which creationists love to trot out. Because Ernst Haeckel's embryos were a fraud, but embryology is not. We still know that embryology does prove evolutionary theory, because things do go through certain stages in the womb, where certain features that may have split off and developed into gills on a fish develop into the facial features on humans. So I don't know what he's trying to get at, because he's calling it a false analogy, which is using reasoning, which doesn't apply to the case in point. It does apply to the case in point, because embryology does prove evolution. So one more down, let's get on to the next ones. In his next point, the author argues that evolutionists aren't giving people all the evidence, such as in the case for geological strata, which we know are formed slowly, and we can even date them with radiometric dating, but the author claims that a lot of geological events can happen very quickly, again referencing the earlier geologist that believes the Grand Canyon was formed by a giant flood. He's wrong, because geological strata are formed slowly over time, and we can date them to verify these claims. So another one down, let's move on to the next one. The next is a favorite of creationists, which is appealing to authority. The author obviously doesn't get the irony in this statement, but it goes that all scientists agree that evolution is a proven fact. And yes, most scientists do. Some don't, but usually they're not in fields that directly deal with evolution. They're in fields that they can ignore evolution largely. So I don't understand what he's trying to get at here. The creationists love to use this one when they say, look at these 1,000 scientists that believe that creationism is true. Who are you to say you're wrong? And this is very false, because regardless, just a few hundred believe it in the first place, but this sort of argument doesn't make any sense, because people believe evolution based on the evidence, not on the people that believe it, while people believe in creation based on the people that believe it, not the evidence, because there is no evidence. In the next example, the author argues that evolution is equivocation, which is using a single word in more than one sense. This is often used by creationists, especially in their example of kinds, because a kind can mean anything that they want it to be, if it's a species, such as in the case of humans, or a class, as in the case of felines. But let's look at his example. The existence of many different breeds of dogs, of several species of finches, and of a range of human ethnic groups around the world all show how evolution takes place, and this is true. These all do show how evolution takes place, because it's changes over time, making something new. This is not what he would call macroevolution, or as he calls it, microbes to man evolution, but it is evolution, so I don't see anything wrong here. He's just trying to confuse you about what evolution is in the first place. He's trying to say that evolution can only be proven if we see a dog turned into a cat or a cat into a dog, and this isn't how it works. And if you know anything about evolution, you know that this is not true, because evolution is not two current species changing into another current species. That's nothing at all. That is in fact a straw man of evolution. But moving on, let's look at his next example. The next argument doesn't really make sense, but we'll look at it anyway, and he calls it affirming the consequent. If A is true, then B is true, therefore A is true too. And his example goes, punctuated equilibrium satisfactorily explains the lack of transitional life forms in the fossil record because from time to time, evolution occurred so rapidly that these transitional forms were not preserved in the intervening strata. And this is true, this happens. Sometimes transitional forms aren't preserved, but we do have a lot of transitional forms. In fact, everything you see is a transitional form between something. It only takes a certain pressure to make the transitional form transition. The only reason that we classify species as species today is because it hasn't been long enough for them to change. Eventually, they probably will change based on environmental pressures. If there are no environmental pressures, they won't change. Take the coelacanth, for example. The coelacanth is very adapted to its environment, so it hasn't had to change for millions of years. Humans haven't had to change for a few 100,000 years because they can adapt their environment itself. The author doesn't seem to understand that transitional forms do exist, they do pop up, and we have seen them. Things like the Archaeopteryx and the Tiktaalik. As you've seen here in this article, creationists often use misinformation and logical fallacies to promote their beliefs. You've just been watching The Southern Atheist. If you liked the video, leave a like, and if you want to see more content like this, subscribe. Thanks for watching.